So it's my pleasure to introduce Adolf Grünbaum Memorial Lecture. Before introducing our speaker today, let me remind you of all the contributions that Adolf Grünbaum made both to philosophy and to the University of Pittsburgh. So Adolf Grünbaum was the first Andrew Mellon Professor of Philosophy at the University of Pittsburgh. He came to us in 1960. And he was hired away from Lehigh, and he stayed at Pitt from 1960 to 2018. It's not an exaggeration to say that he was a world preeminent philosopher of physics of his generation. And he was instrumental in building philosophy at Pitt, and maybe in creating philosophy of physics as one of the centers in philosophy of science. Among other things, he founded the Center of Philosophy of Science in 1960, which was at the beginning just a program. He created the annual lecture series in 1961, and this year it is a 53rd occurrence of this series. In fact, I've been told it is the longest philosophy series of talks. He published many important books in the philosophy of physics, but also in other areas, in philosophy of science. In philosophy of physics, I will just mention philosophical problems of space and time, and outside philosophy, the foundations of psychoanalysis in 1984. So to honor his memory and his legacy, both to philosophy and to the University of Pittsburgh, the center has established a lecture, the annual Memorial Lecture, which is given every year thanks to a gift from his daughter, Barbara Grünbaum, and her family. We're extremely grateful for this gift. This year, the Adolf Grünbaum Memorial Lecture will be given by Professor Thomas Icard. So it's my real pleasure to introduce Thomas, who is Professor of Philosophy and by courtesy of Computer Science at Stanford University. Thomas works in a range of areas in philosophy, but also psychology and computer science. He has published widely in these areas in journals such as Cognition Psychology and Philosophy, such as Philosophy of Science and Mind, and he has published in all the best proceedings of computer science conferences. He is also finishing a book called Resource Rationality, and we hope to be able to read it in the coming years, hopefully next year. He is the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Philosophical Logic, as well as the associate editor of Open Mind Discoveries in Cognitive Science. I will only mention a couple of his papers, one which I've been particularly influenced by. One of them was published in 2018 in Philosophy of Science. It's called Bayes, Bounds, and Rational Analysis. And the other one recently in Mind, and it's called Why Be Random? And today, Thomas will be talking about causal abstraction and computational explanation.
The last event of the semester, so we are going to end with a bang, with one of my favorite philosophers. So, but before introducing him, I wanted to remind you that this is a Grünbaum Memorial Lecture, and that Thomas Icard is a Grünbaum Memorial Lecturer. For those of you who don't know Adolf Grünbaum, I guess very few in this room, but let me remind you of who Adolf Grünbaum was. He was the first Andrew Mellon Professor of Philosophy at the University of Pittsburgh. He was hired in 1960 from Lehigh, where he was already a very successful philosopher of physics. His contribution to philosophy and to Pitt is actually enormous. He was both an intellectual giant in the philosophy of physics, but he was also an institution builder. He literally built philosophy and philosophy of science at Pitt. He was at Pitt from 1960 to 2018 when he left us. I think it's fair to say, I'm not a philosopher of physics, but I think it's fair to say that he was a world preeminent philosopher of physics of his generation, and that he trained a very large number of philosophers of physics here at Pitt. Among the many things he did is that he created the center in 1960, which was first a program, then became a center. And he was a program and center director from 1960 to 1978. I still have 8 years to go to Pitt. Come back in 8 years. And I have been a director a longer time than Adolf. He created the ALS, the Annual Lecture Series, in 1961. So we have a 53rd iteration of this program. It's actually, I've been told, I don't know whether it's true, the longest lecture series in philosophy that has ever existed, which is really quite remarkable. His work is very important. He published some landmark books in philosophy of physics, such as Philosophical Problems of Space and Time in 1963. But his work is not limited to philosophy of physics. He had a tremendous influence on psychoanalysis. He was a very harsh critic of psychoanalysis, both in theory and in practice. He published The Foundations of Psychoanalysis in 1984, a very important critical take on psychoanalysis. Now, in honor of his memory and legacy, his daughter, Barbara Grünbaum, made a donation to, and her family, made a donation to the center 5 years ago now, and that donation has led to the Grünbaum Memorial Lecture, where, of course, as a center, extremely grateful for this gift and to be able to preserve Adolf's memory and to remember his contribution to both Pete, philosophy, and the center. And we are delighted that this year the Adolf Grünbaum Memorial Lecture will be given by Professor Thomas Icard from Stanford. Actually, I didn't ask Icard or Icard. He's a man who's very easy to. But somebody be a good, somebody a true answer to the question.
Oh, yes, I actually don't know what it is.
Oh, okay. Oh, we're going to stick with the French version. So it's going to be Icard from now on. All right. So it's my really great pleasure to introduce someone I really admire and really like, Professor Thomas Icard, who is professor of philosophy and computer science at Stanford University. Even so, this semester he's visiting Caltech. He worked in the philosophy of cognitive science, also in computer science. He has done some work in cognitive science, and quite a lot of work in cognitive science and in psychology. He has published widely in journals in science, in psychology, in cognitive science, in computer science, all the important journals and conference proceedings. I won't give you a complete list, as well as in philosophy. He is writing a book on one of his important areas of research called Resource. This is a former title. I'm not sure this is the current title. Okay, the current title is Resource Rationality, and which is a work in progress that we should see in a year or two. Among other contributions to the field, he is the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Philosophical Logic. He does a lot of formal work in logic and in computer science. He is also, because that's a lot of time, the associate editor of Open Minds, which is one of the new journals in cognitive science, which I think is an open journal that is growing and that is becoming quite influential and quite successful in the field of cognitive science. Among the work I'd like to mention, maybe he has a paper on resource rationality, which was actually very influential. I think in philosophy of science, is that right? A paper in Mind, which is recently about randomness. He's done some work with Josh Lowe on formal models of causal judgment, which has been extremely influential, and I'm a huge fan of that work, and a lot of work which I don't understand in computer science. So I won't say a whole lot about that part, and in logic about that part of the work. And I'm very pleased that you are today giving us a lecture at the end of the semester. Thank you, Thomas.
Extremely kind introduction. It's really quite an honor to be here speaking at Pitt in this department and program that's obviously been so influential in the whole world of philosophy, but also on me in particular. Just the number of things that have come out of this department and program, it's remarkable. So I'm just pleased to be here. I really appreciate your being here with me today. I'm also kind of humbled to be giving this Grünbaum Memorial Lecture because, as Edouard mentioned, he contributed not just to Foundations of Physics, Philosophy of Physics, but also psychoanalysis, and even had an article back in, I think, 1952, arguing that the kind of thing that I'm going to be talking about today, namely causal analysis of mental phenomena, is possible in the first place. this very interesting article, even I guess before he was here at Pitt. So I'm sort of humbled and just delighted to be here. I also want to mention I've been working over the past years with a number of remarkable students, some of whom are here today. And the paper that I'm going to be talking about today is actually joined with a bunch of different people. Different aspects of it are partly joint projects with some current students. And I just wanted to mention them at the very beginning. One is Atticus Geiger, who recently finished his PhD in linguistics. Also Jacqueline Harding, who is current PhD student in philosophy and symbolic systems, and another student, Delager Ebling, who is just finished his PhD in computer science. A lot of what I'm going to talk about is joint work with them in different combinations, and especially a big part of the last part of this talk about artificial neural networks, that kind of thing, is part of a project that really Atticus has spearheaded and led. Okay, so what is my topic today? It's really cognitive science. This is a talk in cognitive science, foundations of cognitive science. And as any cognitive scientist, I'm interested in aspects of how the mind works and how we're able to do all the fascinating things that we're able to do. So how is it that we're able to kind of get around complex, messy worlds, achieve goals, take ends to means, track goals, do all this complicated kind of navigation of the world? How is it that we're able to sort of talk so seamlessly and make inferences so seamlessly of possibly quite complicated sorts, like little inference patterns like this? Why is it so easy for adult English speakers to know that if everyone made it to the meeting before 4 p.m., then everyone made it to the meeting before 4:15 p.m.? Why is that so enormously easy, given that this is a fairly complex construction, if you think about it? And we also are so easily attuned to the fact that if you change everyone to no one, it flips. It's no longer kind of a good entailment in that direction, but it flips, right? If no one made it to the meeting before 4:15, then no one made it there before 4, and so on and so forth, right? What's going on in the mind such that these are so easy? Other kinds of things that we're interested in cognitive science, things like, why is this sentence at a first glance, why does it sound meaningful? So if someone just tells you more people have been to Berlin than I have, that sort of just sounds like you said something. But then you think about it a little bit more, and it's sort of not really clear at all what you said. And so on and so forth. Lots and lots of stuff about natural language. And then if you get into the parts of cognitive science where people are interested in kind of drawing the boundary between adult human cognition and either infant cognition or non-human animal cognition, you have tasks like these that, of course, for adult humans are very easy. These tasks where you're given 2 pairs of items and you are supposed to say basically yes if the pairs are both the same or both different, and no if the relation between the two is different. So one's the same, the other one's different. The so-called hierarchical equality task. Lots of documentation about where in infancy, and also where in the animal kingdom you see success at this task, what's accounting for the difference between success and non-success, and so on and so forth, right? So all the usual kind of explananda of kind of high-level cognitive science. That's really the topic. And as in this domain, as in other domains, we usually want to give some kind of causal story about this. We want to know what are the kind of causal components that conduce to these behaviors in a kind of Woodwardian interventionist kind of sense. And it's been long suggested that a good place to look is the brain, right? So much of what is allowing us to do what we do, cognitively speaking, is going on in there. Maybe there's other stuff to bring to bear as well, but a lot of stuff is going on in there. But that still underdetermines the question of what are we going to kind of look for in there, in the brain and the nervous system more broadly. So what is the kind of right set of building blocks? What's the right level of abstraction to be talking about these phenomena, the kinds of phenomena that I mentioned? So is it at the level of kind of biochemistry, like ATP and ion channels? Is it slightly more abstract, like neurons and glial cells, kind of cellular level? Is it even more abstract, things like neural populations? Or that's the basic fundamental unit of analysis? Or is it something perhaps even more abstract, things like computations over symbols and representations and that kind of thing? Okay. So lots of controversy about this question, of course, but an old answer, kind of an animating idea of the beginnings of cognitive science in the 1950s, is that this last one, computation over symbols, could play an important role in accounting for a lot of these behavioral patterns and interesting cognitive phenomena that we're interested in. So there's some sense in which brains at least maybe in bodies in environments, but brains kind of play a starring role here in kind of implementing computations of some sort, right? So there's some respect in which, so the hypothesis goes, brains are actually performing computations. So we can understand computations in a number of different ways, models like Turing machines or computer programs, algorithms. I'll say a little bit more about that momentarily, but this is a kind of inspiring idea for cognitive science as we know it today. We have decades and decades of work that's explored this hypothesis in different ways. Okay, so then that just raises the question of what would it be? What is it for one of these things on the left, something like a brain? And for much of this talk, I'm going to call that a kind of low-level system, something like a brain that we kind of understand. It's to some extent we understand its sort of mechanical components to implement something that's relatively high level, like an algorithm or a computation or a program. Right? Just what would it be for that relation to hold? Okay. So that's the basic question, and a lot has been written on this. And one particular inspiration for what we're going to be talking about here is work that was done already in the 1980s in the context of PDP. So this is I think, paper that should be better known probably than it is by Smolinski that appeared in the second volume of the PDP volumes, chapter like 26 or something. And he kind of explores what it would be for everything is the setting of PDP neural network models. But what would it be for one low-level model to implement a kind of higher-level model? And it's something like homomorphism or isomorphism, something along those lines. It's not completely spelled out in all detail, but there's kind of gestures toward the kind of thing that I'm going to be talking about here. So the current project is basically to dress up some of these earlier ideas and earlier kind of impressions of what this might look like with a modern causal perspective. So using tools that have been developed over the last 5 to 10 years in the field of causal inference to try to shed some further light on that question of what would it be for a low-level system like a brain to implement a high-level, say, algorithm. Okay, so this is going to proceed in 3 steps. And the first 2 will be fairly quick. The third will be where most of the action will be. So the first is we want to say, at least at a first glance, what it would be for a low-level system, something like a brain, to be construed as a causal system. So what does it mean to think of that in causal terms? This is not particularly mysterious. It's not novel, but we have to say something about that. And the second, and this is a little bit maybe less familiar, is to construe computational models in causal terms as well. Okay, so we want to sort of think of computations and algorithms and such through a causal lens. And then once we do that, this is sort of where we want to be, because then both the low level and the high level are kind of formalized in the same kind of way. They're kind of captured with the same theoretical apparatus, such that we can proceed to step 3 to try to say what is the right relation that we want to say holds between the low level and high level, such that if that does hold, then we can say that the low level is basically implementing the high level. Okay. So that's where we're going to go. Very quick on 1, very quick on 2, and then most of the time will be spent on 3. And I should also say, I'm not sure exactly what the norms are, but I'm happy to be interrupted at any point. That's fine with me, but I won't do that if that's a bad idea. So it's kind of up to you. Okay. All right, so first let me just say a brief thing about what I mean by causal system. By causal system, I have in mind sort of causal models, structural causal models, and I'm only going to use a tiny bit of this for this talk. It's something like a 3-tuple that consists of what we'll call a signature. So this is basically just the kind of underlying language that we're using to talk about the causal setup that involves 2 classes of variables These are just sort of determinables, things that could take on any number of possible values. Think of them as something like random variables. We're going to separate, this is not going to play a starring role in anything we're going to say today. We commonly separate these into the endogenous variables, which are the ones that we're kind of talking about, thinking about, asking questions about, manipulating, and so on. So it's the kind of thing that's salient in our discussion. And then exogenous variables, which are basically anything else that exerts an influence on the variables that we care about. So that's a kind of conceptual distinction. In certain setups, it becomes a more formal distinction. And in fact, here, we could, for example, put a probability distribution on the exogenous variables or just consider them as set in some way, but I'm not going to talk much about that in this talk. But what will matter is that a causal system specifies for each endogenous variable a structural functional mechanism. So this basically tells you what X's value is as a function of the values of other variables, including possibly exogenous variables. And I've drawn it here or written it here in the worst case where this is all of the variables typically only depend on some subset of the variables. But these are so-called functional mechanisms, and it's kind of what makes these things causal, because you're sort of specifying how variables depend on their value on values of the variables. And that really gets cashed out through the notion of an intervention, which is, for our purposes, basically just mechanism replacement. So you take one of these, so you have we're basically carving out some part of the world, which is and carving that into endogenous variables. And then there's all these exogenous sources of variation that we're maybe not aware of, or that we're not modeling or whatever. And then we could imagine going into that causal system and kind of changing the way that it works. And the simplest way of doing this, the way that's kind of standard, kind of basic type of intervention, is just taking, for example, the function for X, and whatever it did before, we just replace it with a constant function. This is a so-called hard intervention, where we just remove any dependence that X has on other variables and just say it's going to be fixed to this one value. So imagine like reaching into an experimental setup or a setup where people are, taking some type of drug or something, and you just give someone the drug and make them take it. So you override whatever mechanism might have given rise to their decision about whether to take it or not, and you kind of override that. So this kind of idea of sort of reaching into the system and changing it is captured by mechanism replacement, and that's the sense in which these things capture kind of causal, something causal. Okay, so that's a very kind of bare bones kind of notion of what it is to be a causal system, but it's going to be enough so I won't actually need any probability for today, but we can certainly talk about it if people want to talk about it. Okay, so if that's what a causal system is, then it's probably not mysterious that it's pretty straightforward to think about brains as causal systems, right? These sort of mathematical models of, for example, neurons, neural firing patterns, and that kind of thing can at least be construed as functional dependencies of variables on other variables. So I've written here just as one example, Hodgkin-Huxley model, which I realize that it's controversial, the extent to which that's really understandable in mechanistic terms, but you might think that, a good model of something like ion currents or firing patterns or whatever is going to be a function of some other things. And once you specify what function that is, then you're already in the domain of causal systems as we're understanding here, in this minimal sense that we're understanding here. Okay. And as you move up to talking about, artificial neural models that really have as the sort of building blocks more clusters of neurons. So these kinds of PDP type models that are supposed to model brains at higher levels of abstraction, then it's even clearer the extent to which these are basically just specifying how the system evolves through time, or how activity is propagated through a network or whatever, right? So just functional dependencies of variables on other variables. That's kind of all we need to be a causal system in this kind of minimal sense. Okay, so brains as causal systems, I hope that's kind of just uncontroversial, that we can kind of think about them in that way. So you have a mathematical model, and for the most part, it will be, in many cases, it will be reasonable to treat that as a causal model with the kind of causal direction and so on. Okay, But what about programs? This is the part that might be a little bit less familiar. But if you go into just the practice of programming and also program analysis, you'll see that it's quite useful to capture the notion of control flow of a program. So you have a program written, and there's some sense in which, changing something at some point in the program can have downstream effects on the working of the program, right? And it might not affect other things. So there's a kind of causal influence that changes to a program can have on other aspects of the program. And that's often captured by different kind of models of control flow in actual programming languages. But for our purposes, for kind of these more kind of theoretical purposes, it's actually helpful to think about this in a really bare bones way, as computations are something like Turing machine computation. So a very just simple model of computation, just a Turing machine program. And now, what does it mean to think of a Turing machine as a causal system? Well, of course, in some sense, the Turing machine is just a mathematical object, right? It's just a tuple of, subset and some functions. But we often think of it as a kind of mathematization of a mechanical kind of device, some sort of idealized mechanical device. And if you think of it through that lens, then you can imagine what it would be to kind of intervene on a Turing machine program, right? What do? Well, you go to some cells that are encoding, housing zeros and ones, and the intervention is basically holding those cells fixed to some specific values. Okay, so maybe the first 9,000 cells or whatever represent some concept, then you can just hold those fixed to be, I'm thinking about this particular thing or whatever. And then let the program run, right? And that intervention, if you then block any rewrites to that, it'll have basically the same kind of effect that a causal intervention would have. That is, you're never going to rewrite those cells. It's a sort of hard intervention. And you just see what the effects of that intervention might be, right? So what sort of downstream consequences of the program are there from doing that intervention? Okay, so if you do that, and you kind of construe, it's really mathematically, it's just adding one more component to what a Turing machine is, construed now as a causal system, you can actually show that Turing machines, construed as such, and causal models, as long as you make all the functions computable, are actually equivalent. And the equivalence here, the relevant one, is they can encode all the same patterns of counterfactuals. Right? So anything that you can kind of do with one, you can do with the other. But whereas causal models, given by functional specifications, are kind of declarative ways of representing causal situations, programs are more kind of procedural ways of representing causal information. So you don't write down the equations, it's kind of implicit in the dynamics of the way the program works. Okay, good. So we now have point 1 and point 2 are already done, right? So brains, we can think of them in causal terms. We can also think of programs in causal terms. This is not, by the way, specific to high-level programming languages like Java or C++ or Turing machines. I would claim, this is not a formal claim or sort of mathematical claim, but sort of any reasonable computational model can be given this kind of causal interpretation. And so we can use Turing machines as one example, but it can be sort of go-to programs or register machine, like anything that's sort of a reasonable model of computation. You can probably do the same thing. All right, so that's part 1. Part 2 now on the table. But for the majority of the time, for the rest of the time, I want to talk about causal abstraction. So what is causal abstraction? What's a very familiar kind of problem in philosophy of science? We want to understand phenomena at different levels of analysis. And in this specific case of causal modeling, the sort of setup is usually that we have some low-level causal model, some low-level causal system that we'll call L. And we have a high-level causal system that I'll call H. And the question basically is, when do we want to consider it that H is an abstraction of L, such that they are basically consistent descriptions of the same underlying reality? That is, they could just be two different levels of description of the same underlying reality. what needs to be the case in order for them to be kind of coherent in that way? That's the question. And a lot of the current work is inspired by some work done by Halupka, Eberhardt, and Perona that was basically out to, in a bunch of different domains, out searching for macro variables. So you have situations where you have a bunch of low-level data, in this case, weather data, the stuff I've presented up here, weather data like measurements of measurements of temperature on the surface of the Pacific Ocean and wind direction and that kind of thing. And you want to basically extract from that macro variables that capture some kind of emergent causal patterns in that low-level data. Right? And what they showed is using a very nice algorithm that's kind of well-motivated and everything, that you can, in this case and many others like it, you can actually extract macro variables that are basically aggregations of all the low-level variables and find kind of pretty reliable, or at least consistent with the data, reliable causal patterns, like westerly winds tend to cause El Nino, where those are both aggregates over wind and temperature respectively, or easterly winds tend to cause La Nina, and so on. So this is sort of applied work where they're actually showing, how you would discover macro variables, but this has inspired a whole bunch of theoretical work, kind of here at the border between philosophy of science and computer science, which is trying to kind of capture what is this relation exactly. So maybe whatever it is, those cases are instances of it, but what's the broader set of relations of which this is an instance? So what is this relation of causal abstraction, and can we kind of circumscribe that? So what's the basic picture from a kind of formal perspective is you have the low-level model, and you have the high-level model, and I want to consider basically a function or some functions from the low level to the high level. And this is usually conceived in the following terms. I have a map that we'll call tau from total settings of the low-level model. This is basically ways things could be, the settings of all the variables at the low level, to a ways things could be at the high level, in the high-level description. And so that's a map from descriptions to descriptions, essentially, of all the sort of facts. And then you also have a map omega from operations or interventions on the low level to operations or interventions on the high level. Okay. And so the question is, what kind of conditions should we impose in order to say that, H is an abstraction of L, that they're possibly different descriptions of the same underlying L? And the picture that's emerged in the literature is the following. It's basically a commutative diagram. It says that if I take a low-level intervention, and then I go in one direction, I map that to a high-level intervention, omega of I, and then I solve the high-level model. So what does that mean? That just means, determine all the determine the solution to all the remaining kind of functional equations. Or if you're thinking of a Turing machine program, run the program. So I get my solution for the high-level model. I get a setting of all the variables at the high level. And suppose I instead go this other direction to take the intervention and then I solve at the low level. So I determine all the values of all the remaining variables at the low level. And then I take tau of that. I should get back to the same thing. Those should be consistent. So this basically says that they're kind of interventionally kind of compatible. That interventions at the low level agree with interventions at the high level, kind of up to that according to that translation. And so, in a single equation, it's basically that. And this was formulated explicitly by Rubinstein et al. In 2017. Okay. So that's a reasonable kind of constraint. It turns out in many of the discussions of this, the relation of abstraction is a very specific one, and one that's pretty easy to think about. And that's sometimes called constructive abstraction. What is a constructive abstraction? Going back to this picture, we start with the low-level system. And now suppose that we can just kind of cluster the low-level variables into cells, such that we get basically a partition of the low-level variables. So we find some reasonable kind of partition of these, and we kind of have the suspicion that like those clusters are kind of working in concert as basically one variable. Then we can sort of consider an abstraction of that, where I just consider basically the clusters, in effect, and map those clusters from the low level to the high level. So this basically says, for example, that tau, this tau function, decomposes along this partition, right, in these sort of component functions. So that's often how this kind of thing works. That's what was going on in the Chalupka et al. Case, and people have even talked about this back in the 1950s. And it was explicitly formulated in this paper by Beckers and Halpern a few years ago. And I mean, if you want another angle on that, we've recently shown that a constructive abstraction is basically the closure of some very natural operations. So you take your low-level model, and then you can merge variables. So just consider two variables as one. You can also merge values under certain circumstances. So you can pretend, you basically ignore the difference between two different values of variable. And then you can also marginalize. So basically throw out a variable and consider the system that ignores that variable. So these are three different operations, and you can actually show that being a constructive abstraction is the same as being basically the result of some combination of these operations, and vice versa. So that's a kind of constructive way to understand constructive abstraction. Okay, but you might think, for many purposes, this is actually too specific, that this kind of clustering is maybe not the right one. And so even before that, that notion of abstraction was, or I should say, our way into this is to think about things a little bit algebraically. So this is the sort of most kind of abstract part of the talk, where we can formulate the notion of an intervention algebra. So what is an intervention algebra? The simplest case to think of is that phi is just a set of hard interventions. Remember, hard interventions are those interventions as a set of variable to a specific value. Okay. And now consider the star to be function composition, so doing one and then the other. So if I do set x to x and y to y, and I do both of those, I'm setting x to x and y to y. So you can kind of ask about and this is just about signatures. This is just not about causal models at all. It's just about variables and their values. But you can ask, like, what is the kind of characterization of this little algebra that you get in this way? And you can show that it's completely characterized by two rules. This is basically a representation theorem to say that there's sort of two things you can say. One is if I set one variable to one value and a different variable to a different value, I can do it in either order. So the order doesn't matter if I'm going between variables. And second, if I intervene on the same variable twice, the second one wins. Basically, it overrides the first one. And it turns out that's kind of all there is to say about the algebraic behavior of hard interventions. As an aside, this same pattern comes up all over the place, like in logic and programming. If you consider variable assignments, then mutations to variable assignments, those are also intervention algebras, and they satisfy all and only these two laws. But so for our purposes, interventions satisfy these two laws, hard interventions. And you can actually get from this a natural order on interventions. This is just a little bit of, it's the kind of thing you do in lattice theory or other kinds of algebra. You can say that x is less than or equal to y if and only if doing x and then y, or sorry, y and then x, composing y with x gives you back y. The order actually here does matter, unlike in lattice theory, for example, which in the simple case where these are just hard interventions is just subset. So it's just saying you're setting more variables than before, and you're agreeing with all the ones from before. Okay. But the important point I want to make at this stage is that you can consider intervention algebras that are not hard interventions. So hard interventions satisfy these laws. You can also imagine other kinds of operations on causal models, classes of operations on causal models that also satisfy these two kind of laws. So I'll talk about some in a little bit, but these two laws you might think give you a certain kind of modularity of intervention, right? They're kind of saying that you can do them in any order, and doing one doesn't wipe out the other unless they're kind of with respect to the same variable. Right, so this is kind of a nice behavior of interventions. And so we call one of these things that satisfies those two properties an intervention algebra, which is just to say they behave like hard interventions. Okay, so if you take that notion now, you can go back to this general setting of have this map tau and this map omega from settings to settings and interventions to interventions, and then we can just say our notion of abstraction is going to say this holds just in case whenever I is less than or equal to j, some intervention below level is less than or equal to some other intervention below level, that's kind of preserved at the high level. Okay, so it's this kind of order preserving map, this specific order that I wrote down, and then also do the commuting diagram. So we always want that. We always want the conditionals to, counterfactual conditionals to agree. And then this is a notion that kind of generalizes the notion that was introduced by Rubinstein et al. Of so-called exact transformation. And it's much more expansive than constructive abstraction. You don't have to do the kind of partitioning. And it encompasses a lot more. And the one that I want to highlight here, which we are going to use, is a notion of a translation. So this is a special case of a exact transformation, which is not a constructive abstraction, but is quite useful. So imagine it's maybe a little bit of a misnomer to have L and H be low level and high level, because here they're sort of the same level. But imagine these functions are actually bijective. And suppose that omega is actually a homomorphism. Okay, so it's actually distributing over this function composition. Well, then basically L and H are just sort of different descriptions of the same underlying reality. They're just different, they're sort of fully compatible. It's actually an isomorphism in this case. So it's a very strong notion of being the same, of course. But what's going on here, the thing that I want to highlight that's maybe a little bit different from other settings when you're talking about isomorphisms, is that this can only be non-trivial when one of the classes of interventions is not the hard ones. Right? This can't really work if the hard interventions at the low level are, are what you're considering, and you're considering the hard interventions at the high level. You can just sort of work this out that you can't make it non-trivial. You can't change the variables. But this is saying we can change the variables, but for one or the other, or possibly both, the interventions you're going to be considering that will make this all work out have to be so-called soft interventions or other kinds of mechanism replacement. So not just replacing X's function with the constant function, something else. And I'll give you one example of that in a bit. Okay. You can also do all of this approximately. Okay, so I'll sort of, you can, basically what I've done here is take the notion of abstraction and said, consider your favorite distance metric, or however you want to do this approximately. That also makes sense and has been explored. Okay, so now that's the notion of abstraction, of causal abstraction. It's actually a family of notions of causal abstraction. And now the kind of motivating idea, the connection back to computational explanation, is that computational explanation, at least in cognitive science, is really just a flavor of causal explanation, right? All we're really doing is specifying high-level causal models that capture important low-level details that should show up at the aggregate macro level. Okay. And it's kind of causal all the way down. Okay. So we're all just doing causal stuff. That's not a new idea. It goes back even before these papers. It's a very familiar idea. But I want to say something now about how we would try to kind of substantiate this picture. So obviously, ideally, we would like to do some experiments on people that would allow us to test some causal abstraction claims, right? So when a group of experimental participants succeeds at some cognitive task or doesn't, and we want to explain that, we can hypothesize a high-level causal model computation, and then go in and basically check whether the person's implementing that computation. We obviously can't do that, but luckily, these days we have other kinds of artifacts that also show very interesting intelligent behavior. And I have in mind here artificial neural networks that have just arisen in the last decade or so, that actually show a lot of the very same behaviors that we pointed out in the very beginning, the same behaviors that are interesting to cognitive scientists. So now we can kind of do the cognitive science of things like large language models. And there's a bunch of people doing that now. And luckily, unlike with humans, we can go in and do all the interventions we like in these, well, not depends, sometimes stuff is proprietary, you can't get in there, but in principle, we can go into a system and actually play with its internals and test hypotheses of causal abstraction. Okay. So the last part of the talk, this very last part of the talk, is going to describe some of that work. So starting, oh yeah, so it's the same question. When does a low-level system like an artificial neural network basically kind of implement, in the sense of implementation, a program? Okay, so here's a simple test case that we did already now, I think 3 years ago, started on 3 or 4 years ago, which is it was just a little data set, or an artificial data set that Atticus made called MQNLI. And this is basically just a very difficult entailment task. Like, people wouldn't be so good at this, but artificial models at the time, circa 2017, 18, were also not very good at it. They're basically like multiply quantified sentences in artificial kind of very unnatural English, but that have different combinations of quantifiers and negations and so on. So it's like a little fragment of first order logic, but in language, essentially. And so the task is you're given pairs of natural language sequences, and it's a 3-way classification task. You determine whether the first entails the second, whether they contradict each other, or whether it's just neutral, which is just neither of those. And this is quite a hard task. So like LSTMs that were big around, how many years ago was this? Less than a decade ago, but they were kind of pre-transformer models. Could not really do this the best at the time. But then come along transformer models, and they can do this. Right? It turns out they're pretty good at this. Even this work that we did in 2021 was with the BERT model, if people are familiar with that, one of the first transformer models. So the question is, if LSTMs are failing, but transformer models are succeeding, what allows them to succeed? It's a standard kind of question about what's going on inside that accounts for this. And so one hypothesis that we made is that if you just take basically the sort of simplest little logical model about how to do this. Oh, is that a... Oh, those are just things that could be there or not there. Yeah, those could be like knots or modifiers or whatever. That's all that is. Yeah. It just gives you some indication of how complex these things can be and how big the data set is. Yeah, thanks. Any other interruptions are welcome to. So you can specify a little computational model of this, which is actually also the way that data was generated, in fact, which basically goes sort of pair by pair, lexical item by lexical item, comparing, like basically looking at logical lexical relationships and then propagating those up a tree. So I have that, for instance, pug is a kind of dog, and then that gets combined with something else, and gets combined with something else, and you can determine at the very top of the tree, what is the logical relationship between the two sequences, So our hypothesis was that in some ways, this is kind of the only way to do it. It's a really hard task, right? And maybe it's failure of imagination, but we kind of couldn't think of any way to actually succeed at this task and not do something similar to the way that the data was generated. So we didn't have a proof of that, obviously, but this is a little bit similar. I'll just mention as a side remark, because Brendan is here. This is related to resource rationality kind of stuff as well. So you might hypothesize that there, once you get to constrained solutions that actually have to work in a physically embodied system, there's just not that many possibilities, right? Okay, so that was our animating hypothesis, but then we went to test it. And so here's the way that we test it. How do you check whether a causal abstraction holds in an A and N? What we do is the following. This is a kind of idea of Atticus's, which is you take pairs of pairs, so pairs of inputs. Like this is a simplified version of what was really done and not three words long. But this is not a tree, implies this is not an elm. A pug runs entails a dog runs. And then we basically make a hypothesis about where in the network some intermediate computation is being performed. In this case, determining the lexical relationship between those two items. Okay, and so we take that proposed location in the network, that kind of putative place in the network where this is happening, and we take two cases that differ on that intermediate representation, and we basically rip out one of them and put it in for the other kind of artificially. It's a kind of it's a causal intervention, right? And then you run it forward to see what would happen. And if you get the proposed output, sort of predicted output according to the model, that is, it gives you the right output if counterfactually tree entailed elm, in this simple example, then that's one little piece of evidence in favor of this computation actually being performed in that way by the network, right? Does that make sense? Okay, so that's what we do, and we do that at kind of at scale in this early work on BERT. And something I just want to point out, maybe this is especially for people that are into this kind of thing, neural network analysis and so on. Over here, I don't want to say anything about the details, but over here is a kind of heat map of where these causal interventions are successful. And the high level point is just only a few places. Only a few places do you actually find encoding of these intermediate computations. But over on the right-hand side is probing success. This is purely information theoretic. Where can you actually kind of linearly decode information about, for instance, lexical entailment? And as you see, information is totally promiscuous in these networks. It's everywhere. But causally efficacious information is very localized. And that's actually potentially a feature of BERT in particular, but in this particular class of models. But just want to emphasize that this is distinctively causal and not just about flow of information. Okay, so two more examples. I think I have time for two more examples. Yep, is that okay? Okay, great. So the first example is much smaller than BERT, actually, just little sort of feed-forward networks of the sort that we had already, many decades ago. These sort of multi-layer perceptrons, where you just have some inputs that are fed into this kind of aggregation layer and then fed through some nonlinear layers, and then you get an output, something like classification. So these have been around forever. They're still a kind of workhorse of much of the work today. And the setting that we looked at for this kind of model was the hierarchical equality task. Okay, so it had actually been claimed a few years ago and before that, that hierarchical equality, this very task that infants of a certain age are able to perform well, kind of is elusive for neural models. There's a bunch of claims that this is the kind of thing that neural models can't do. Maybe it's too abstract or something. And what Atticus showed a couple of years ago was that actually very simple multi-layer perceptrons with just a couple of layers can actually do this, provided we let the representations of these objects be kind of non-localist, distributed representations. So you might like randomly initialize the representation for this thing and that thing and so on. So all of the kind of impossibility arguments had assumed that the encodings of these objects, the input objects, were basically like one-hot encodings, like 0001, 000, right? So kind of that kind of encoding, localist encoding. But if you make it distributed, then they learn it really easily. Okay, that's a kind of possibility. But now our question in the current setting is how? How do they solve this task? Can we actually show the way that they do this? Can we kind of reveal that? And here's our hypothesis about what's going on in this case. It's the obvious one again. How would you solve this task? Well, you take the first two things, check whether they're equal. Look at the second two things, check whether they're equal. And then see whether those two relations are the same. So you do this in sort of 3 steps, right? Where both these steps are kind of happening at the same time in parallel, right? That's not the only way to do this, but that is a way to do it, and it's probably a simple way to do it. So we want to test whether these little simple multi-layer perceptrons are in fact doing that. And here, it turns out to be this sort of point about distributed representations and neural networks turns out to be a big deal. And this is not surprising to anyone who was kind of in the literature in the 1980s, in the kind of PDP revolution, that the kind of common wisdom was that the way that neural models represent stuff is in a highly distributed kind of way. So a cluster of neurons doesn't represent, you don't have like these so-called grandmother neurons, you have the same set of neurons representing a whole bunch of different concepts simultaneously, where they're all participating in that representation of all those concepts or variables or whatever. So one way of seeing what's going on is we're basically doing some kind of rotation. We're changing the basis. We're going from a standard basis of what's given to us by the neural network, and then doing some kind of rotation. And then in that other rotated space, then directions in that space make sense. You can make sense of the different concepts, right? So it's like imagining that we're in a rotated space. So it's kind of linear algebraic kind of manipulation. what we're doing now, causally speaking, is starting with a kind of default set of variables, the ones that we would kind of presumably start with, which are the, the neurons, the nodes in the network, right? Those are the natural kind of variables to start with. But now we're going to basically do a rotation is going to correspond to a translation in the sense that we specified before. So we have a variable set, but now we're going to translate that into another variable set. And that's a kind of abstraction that just gives you something equivalent, but allows you to make sense of these things in causal terms. Okay, so if you want to then go in and do these interchange intervention experiments that I just described a moment ago, then you have to do the following. So there's a lot going on in this picture, and it's probably too small to see anyway, but just look at the middle there. You have this propagation of information up a neural network, and suppose the inputs were those red ones, and they determined all those red values. Same thing for some other inputs that were blue and determined all the blue values, maybe green ones that determine all the green values. Are the colors visible actually? Okay. So then suppose now I'm hypothesizing that x1, x2, x3 are not themselves representing individual concepts, but some rotation is, such that we can identify directions in that rotated space that are doing this. So then what we need to do is basically find that rotation, identify the rotation, and then do the relevant hard interventions in that rotated space, and basically pull them back to do the right interventions on the original kind of neural network as we have it. Right. So if you work that out, you'll see, and this is related to the point I made before, that the relevant interventions you have to do are not just fixing some variable to have some activation value. You actually have to change the functions. Okay. So you have to change the function such that basically information can still flow about the other variables, but it's fixed for the variable that you want it to hold fixed. And that's possible to do. By the way, just from a kind of computer sciencey perspective, this is nice because rotation matrices are nicely parameterizable such that you can do gradient descent to find those parameters. So it makes search much easier. Search was a big bottleneck, and just from a practical perspective on this work before. But okay, so this is what we do. And then lo and behold, we find perfect accuracy on those interchange experiments for hierarchical equality task. Right, so it's kind of perfect. It's exactly doing this computation, but you won't find it if you're searching in the standard basis. You have to rotate.
Yeah. So when you say rotation, is there an inner product in these spaces, or
these are just vector spaces? This is just standard vector spaces, and all we're doing is finding a rotation matrix and applying that to the vector. That's all it's going on. So you might worry that if you do this, it's sort of unconstrained, right? If I can actually come back and change the mechanisms however I want, that you could sort of say that, an underlying neural model is kind of encoding any computation whatsoever. So you might have kind of triviality concerns. And to kind of address this, we go back to this notion of an intervention algebra. And this is just to say that these things are kind of well behaved in the following sense. So if you take the class of soft interventions that you have to do when you pull back basically the results of those interventions, the rotated space, back to the original space that you started in, this class of interventions actually does form an intervention algebra. So they're kind of nice in the sense that they're modular, right? I can do one and then the other without interrupting the one unless they're on the kind of same variable. And that's probably not surprising because we basically just did this kind of isomorphic thing and then pulled it back. So that's all that's really going on there. And the result is that they really are encoding these computations if we allow this kind of rotation, this kind of translation. Okay. So maybe one more quick example, which, we started out with BERT, which is usually a small model. Then we went to a tiny model, a little before neural network. What about the kind of big models that we hear about all the time now? So here's one last experiment that we did on the alpaca model, which is a variant of llama that's kind of fine-tuned with instructions. instruction tuned model, and it's huge, right? It has 32 layers, has 7 billion parameters. It's a big model, and it can do a lot of the kinds of things that LLMs do. But it was, the idea of this is this open access. You can go in and play with it and that kind of thing. So here we gave the following pretty simple task. So the kind of ratio of task difficulty to model size is relevant here. But we looked at the following kind of task. We just start describing some object, and now we're going to basically ask the model if the cost of the object is between two dollar amounts. Okay, so is it between the first one and the second? This was like $2 and $5 or something. Then if it gets $3, then it'll say yes, should say yes. If it says $9, then it should say no. Okay, so first of all, this model and many models like it are able to solve tasks like this, not absolutely perfectly, but pretty well. And so again, the question is, what are they doing? How are they doing it? So, so we devised basically some possible hypotheses. These are, it's not exhaustive, but some possible ways this could go. And the kind of leading hypothesis, the one we thought was most reasonable, is this one that I'll just highlight here called left and right boundary, which basically looks at X, what's the lower number, and Y, that's the higher number, and then Z, that's the number it's trying to determine. And you first check whether it's greater than or equal to X, and you also check whether it's less than or equal to Y, and then you just take an AND of those. Okay, that's not the only way to solve this problem, but it's a way to solve this problem. And so the hypothesis was probably doing this, but we didn't know that, and we wanted to test it. So what do? We did the same kind of exercise of basically searching for places in the network where this stuff could be represented, these computations being performed, and we also simultaneously search for rotations of those sets of neurons. Well, basically, to make a long story short, is it kind of works for this one, but not any of the others. So you actually can find that it is performing this kind of computation, but none of the others get high intervention interchange accuracy. So there's a sense in which it's not performing, at least we couldn't find evidence through a pretty significant search for any of these other alternative ways to solve the problem. So that's also some sort of indication that this doesn't kind of trivialize, you can't always do it. Okay, just as a mention about this, that we also played around a little bit with robustness. So people who have explored these models might know that if you change the way that the question is asked, then that might actually affect its performance. So if you say true instead of yes and false instead of no, or if you add some kind of preambles to it that are just irrelevant, that can also flummox these models, like jumping jacks on Jupiter and now do the task, or fish run deep sea detective agencies. These are all generated by the model in a separate thing. That really doesn't affect performance in any significant way. So it seems like these computations along a whole bunch of different dimensions are pretty robust. They're really there in a kind of pretty robust kind of way. Okay, so that's the third example I wanted to mention. In the way of conclusions, as I mentioned, my interest in these things is not so much as a not so much from the ML perspective, but as a kind of cognitive science that we might like to be able to do on humans, but can do on these artificial models. And so back to the kind of theme of cognitive science, I guess I would just say the extent to which cognitive phenomena can be understood in these kinds of terms, symbolic computational terms, still an open question. It still remains to be seen, still hotly debated. The fact that these artificial neural models do show evidence of that kind of solution to these problems is maybe indicative, but certainly not decisive. So it just may be that if we were going to kind of discover abstractions, and I haven't said anything about that, if we can just discover the best abstractions for the right kind of causal levers on these kinds of systems or on human cognition, the ones that really carve the system at the right causal joints, that maybe looks nothing like classical computational models that we have for the last, many decades. That's certainly possible. But what I hope to have made at least a tiny bit of progress on here and in this work is that we at least have some better sense of kind of what the hypothesis amounts to in the first place. So how we could, at least in principle, test it and what would need to be the case in order for it to be true. So I think I'll stop there, and thanks for listening.
Now I have a plenty of time for questions.
Thank you. Is the notion of interventions necessary to discover this abstractive structure? Because it seems to be possible that one might search for these higher level abstracted and find them without actually having to go through finding, like intervening at some place in the network and seeing or something.
Yeah, good. And it's maybe worth mentioning that that is, of course, what happened in this case.
Right.
The very initial motivating case was all observational data, right? And then they sort of identify aggregate variables that, from a kind of causal discovery perspective, are compatible with the kind of common wisdom in climate science or whatever about the causal direction here. And that's kind of all you can get when that's all you have. But then you might want to be able to test those things, and that's what we're doing in the artificial neural network example. So it's sort of that's also kind of the point of this little thing right here. So if we wanted to determine, this is basically the relation between two linguistic constituents in the input, their logical relationship. That thing is kind of probable throughout the network, but it's not causally relevant. And so we just don't want to say that that information is kind of being represented over there, because it's not in any way being used. Even though it's extractable, it's not being used, and that's what we really care about. What is the actual causal thing that's happening, such that if you went and changed it, things would be different. So it's really fundamentally causal. But maybe you can say more about what you had in mind as an alternative.
Oh, no, it's just, I mean, you have a certain way of thinking about algorithms in which they're sort of fundamentally causal.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's, that's perfectly an acceptable way to think about algorithms, but I don't know if it's necessary. It's certainly not always standard, I would say.
No.
So if you're attributing higher level algorithms to cognitive systems, I was wondering whether you need to invoke a causal language to make that attribution, or whether it's doable without that causal language.
Good, yeah. I mean, there's a whole bunch of stuff that's sort of relevant there, I think. So a lot of work in interpretability, work on interpreting artificial neural networks, is exactly like the kind of thing that you described. You're trying to basically fit a function that describes the input-output behavior pretty well, like something like a decision tree or something. Some sort of model that can kind of, in a simpler way, describe the same input-output behavior. But if you're really interested in what's going on in between, then there's just this massive underdetermination, right? There's tons. I guess we have one example here to actually show what that might look like. There's so many different possible ways of solving this problem that use different intermediate representations and computations over them. And so the proposal is that we can sort of say which one is the right one, because there's a true causal fact of the matter. Right, so it basically solves that underdetermination problem by bringing causality into the picture. But it's like these all work, right? Those are all perfectly good descriptions of the behavior of the network. Input to output, but not
solve that underdetermination without things.
Maybe you can, but I'm not sure. Yeah.
David.
So the original, I think, Smolensky picture of relation is something that looks very familiar from a physicist's point of view.
Okay,
It's very much what a sort of reduction relation looks like in physics.
Yeah.
And I can see a lot of ways in which moving from that sort of dynamical picture to this causal model picture is better suited to the sort of less closed system, less isolated picture of cognition. But I'm interested in some things that potentially get left out. And the immediate one I'm thinking about is time scale.
Yeah.
So for a physics dynamical system, we don't just have a sequence of states, we have a time process under which they're carried out. And obviously we have characteristic timescales for neural processes and cognitive processes.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering how that aspect of things gets captured in this sort of causal way of thinking about the problem.
It's a great question. Yeah. And there's a lot to say about that. So it's sometimes claimed that some of the benefits of this kind of causal modeling approach that I've been adopting here is that it can kind of abstract away from time, right? So you kind of don't have to put time explicitly in the model and still make sense of, for instance, causal relationships among things that kind of are at some equilibrium, for example. So that's kind of a common way of thinking underlyingly what these things really are is abstractions already, right? You're already starting with an abstraction as soon as you have something described in these causal terms. So of course you can do this, and we actually do this pretty explicitly in the program setting, because then time is kind of like, you can always put time back into the picture basically, but it ceases to be interestingly causal. Right? No interesting like causal questions come up except maybe sort of detailed quantitative kind of stuff, but all the qualitative stuff is kind of already determined. But what we do in fact for program analysis is kind of unravel the program through time, right? And then that's what determines what the underlying causal model is, that unraveling. So, but yeah, you're exactly right to put your finger on the fact that time's, I didn't mention it once, right? It's just not really part of this. But you're right also that in the sort of neural case, timescales might be different, and a lot of that's definitely going on. It was the same thing can be said about the El Nino study as well. Of course, you're getting tons and tons of these measurements, so you're also aggregating along those dimensions too.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I have a couple of questions. So the first one is just on this famous example that you had. You mentioned at the end about robustness of results. So does robustness also kind of, do you also get a robustness when you have not just putting something get relevant at the start, but maybe probing the model with different questions or different tasks with that? Do you still get the same kind of representation or same, for example, problem solving strategy to left, right, when you have? And the second question is maybe a bit broader and more on the framework that you had. So I was imagine when you were presenting the commuting where I would imagine it's not like trivial that you get the intervention at the higher level or some kind of variables at the higher level just by looking at it. Is it? I mean, it's not. I don't know whether the map omega, you're guaranteed that it will exist between any two levels.
Good.
Is it just? Is the evidence of the existence of these maps just because certain things, these models can perform certain tasks? So you can mention in first or second example that before transforming models you couldn't perform these tasks, but transforming models to perform these tasks.
Yeah.
Is the success of transformer model performing these tasks give you evidence that these maps exist and therefore we can find these intermediate variables which do the job?
I see. Yeah, good. Okay, so two interesting questions there. On the first one, unfortunately, I don't know that I have anything to say about. I mean, we did the robustness checks that we did, and not any others. So we did do some other ones that I didn't mention, though. The ones about changing the task slightly and seeing whether you still kind of reuse the same computations that you were doing before, and that seemed to check out. But doing something totally different, like doing something that I don't know what you had in mind exactly, but that would be something to be explored.
I was just thinking like having like different tasks. So instead of just before asking whether the price ranges between X and Y, you do some other task and then just.
Oh, I see.
Do a new task like intersections.
Yeah. In this particular case, I'm not sure, but yeah, good question. So for the question about omega, let me see if I'm kind of understanding the question. right? So basically the question is when should we think that such an omega exists in the first place? Yeah. Because as you say, a lot of the work is basically all the work is being done by omega, because it's kind of easy to have translations from a low level to high level, right? It's just, you just have some sort of many to one function and done. That's not so interesting, but it all becomes interesting when you have, at a minimum, this commuting diagram, and very often, even though tau will exist, omega won't. So this is a little bit of a quagmire in the literature, to be honest, because there's different things that people have explored here. Some people have actually, for instance, quantified over the existence of such an omega, say that the relation holds when there exists an omega that satisfies the requisite properties. The constructive notion that I mentioned, this is this one where you cluster and then map. Officially, I didn't mention this explicitly, but officially, this notion actually fixes omega from tau. So you just read off what omega is from tau. So how do you do that? If you want to know what a low-level intervention, this is all about hard interventions, but if you want to know what a low-level hard intervention maps to at the high level, you basically consider all the projections at the low level. So all of the settings, total settings that are consistent with that one, and see if there's something at the high level such that tau maps all of those projections to the corresponding projection up there. So that is a way of just fixing omega from tau. And that's officially what's actually done here. And then it just might not, that will exist, but it won't necessarily commute, right? And so it's kind of a special, we haven't done any kind of analysis of kind of how often this happens, which might be intriguing. Like, it seems like pretty rare. And certainly in the experimental work, it seems like if you just have a bad hypothesis, you won't find it. So yeah, but you asked about the specific experiment that we did, where it was successful in this case and not in the other case. I think that by itself gives no reason to expect there to be such an omega, but it's the other thing that I said that does, namely, there's not that many ways to solve this task plausibly. And so we should expect to find it in there. And so there should be some such omega and tau for that matter. Does that kind of answer the question?
Jim.
Yeah, so could you go back to that theorem that you showed in the kind of in the middle of your talk, where you were talking about starting off with clustering, and then you say, well, there are three different ways of getting it. You can merge, that. So I take it this the theorem, it isn't just a definition of a constructive abstraction.
It could be a definition.
What is the can you say a little bit more about the intuitive notion of what a constructive abstraction is for which this theorem holds, and then what are the cases in which you get failure? I mean, what kind of merging relations or relations between the lower and upper would lead to failure to have a constructive abstraction?
Good. Yeah. Because what else would you think of besides these? And what are the kinds of merging?
Well, you could maybe that's part of what I'm asking you, but maybe various kinds. Well, I'm not even going to conjecture.
Sure. Okay, good. So the original definition, and this was not our definition, this was sort of put on paper, was the kind of implicit and Simon and Folka and so on, but it was put down on paper by Beckers and Halpern. It's basically this, it's this picture, this picture, where you have this tau function and this omega function. So you have these two functions from settings and interventions respectively, and then you have a commuting diagram.
So it's just the commuting diagram.
Commuting diagram plus the fact that tau kind of decomposes along the clustering. So tau is actually given by a bunch of component functions that you just glue together to get the whole function. So that's a kind of intuition about a kind of abstraction, but it's kind of a top-down definition of it, saying some conditions need to be satisfied, and And then if they are, then you're constructive abstraction. This, by contrast, is saying start with a low level, and now just start doing these things. Start merging stuff and start marginalizing. Then wherever you go, you'll be a constructive abstraction. And actually, the reverse is true as well. If you have something as a constructive abstraction, then in fact, I can't remember what the order is, but you basically do these three things in a specific order that always gives you that model from the low-level model, a high-level model from the low-level model. Did I write it in order? Probably not, but it's these three in some order. Gives you every constructive abstraction in that top-down sense. So I don't know, you could do other stuff to a model. So I should also say that I'm hiding details here. So this is formulated, I don't know if I want to go and I'll say something about it, but this is formulated at the level of just signatures. And the theorem holds without qualification with the usual expected definitions of merging and marginalization for the signatures. You have to say what constructive abstraction is purely at the signature level too. That's without the commuting diagram. But then if you want it to work for models, not just signatures, and you want the commuting diagram, then you actually have to have some kind of side conditions on all of these actually. So it's not just always. It's not that you can just forget about a value, like merge these two, forget about the distinction between two values. You can't always do that. But the point is, if you do that in this acceptable way that we kind of make precise, then you do get a constructive abstraction. And moreover, if you want a constructive abstraction, you can do it in all those specific ways. So yeah, in fact, well, merging of variables is actually trivial, but merging of values and also marginalization. I mean, you can't always just throw out a variable and have something that, you know, is consistent with what you had before. So you do have to put on some conditions to make that work at the level of models, not just signatures. Yeah, good question.
Yes, thanks for your patience.
Okay.
Yeah.
I guess I have two questions. One was just a really naive for word question. One that's maybe also naive. The first one is just on the time thing as well. I want you to maybe for an even more smooth way to explain why when consider putting time as a variable in these systems. Because it just seems like, especially with grades or even LLMs, and they change in the context window. How do you decide what to keep fixed, and how do you verify that that's been fixed over some kind of dynamic change in the system? So I mean,
what time scale are you thinking?
I didn't know like, how grades work.
Yeah,
it's you know within I mean within like learning, or I actually couldn't tell you that synaptic pruning, etc. These time scales that grades might work in, the system itself is changing properties.
for sure.
So it's like, how do you kind of hold something fixed when it's dynamically changing? We might have already answered that. And then the second point is just, I felt a little bit of a bait and switch, because beginning between the brains, the computers, finding this relationship, and you mentioned that, yeah. But no, we're doing these experiments on artificial neural networks with various prudential reasons. But I guess I just want to know, what's the hope for doing something like this for brains, right? Especially in light of people like reporting, etc., who've argued like the tools of neuroscience are insufficient to even look at any of these hypotheses. You know, the classic paper that the neuroscientists understand the microprocessor works. They say no. So it's just this a dead end until we get those tools, or maybe can we justify making another kind of reduction between LLMs and brains, or what's your strategy?
Good. Yeah, I like both of those questions. I'll start out with the first one, which is, you know, the abstracting away from time. In some sense, I actually take, I just want to go back to this paper. I kind of take one of the upshots of this paper to be that it is possible to have a causal understanding of the genesis of behavior, that there actually are patterns that are invariant across time to some degree, and that you can capture in a meaningful way. So that's the hypothesis. As you say, your brain is changing constantly in really fundamental ways, but there are nonetheless patterns to be found. Real patterns that hopefully we've given some indication of what those real patterns are, like what it means for them to be there. And it just involves potentially not only aggregation, but also translation and all the other stuff that we've been exploring here. So the very idea that there are commonalities in ways that humans and potentially non-human animals and potentially artificial models solve problems is just kind of, a kind of necessary starting point for cognitive science. So that's the first question. For the second question, I don't think it's a bait and switch, but I think it is a hard question. So, and maybe I can give an analogy. So here's an analogy. So counterfactual. So I'm going to kind of shift attention for the moment to causal inference. In causal inference, there's been a lot of skepticism about counterfactuals in a very specific sense of counterfactuals as counterfactual probabilities, like probabilities with which pairs of potential outcomes are both true, for example. The probability that someone would survive if given the treatment and would perish if not given the treatment, for example. It's a counterfactual because it requires looking at multiple kind of possible situations at once, multiple interventions at once, and assessing the probabilities. There have been kind of arguments that those kinds of things are kind of not actually proper subject matter of science, right? Because you never observe them, right? You can't see whether someone survives and then do the experiment again and see whether they wouldn't have survived. So they're sort of in a very deep way, kind of not empirical. Nonetheless, it's been quite helpful in the field of causal inference to clarify what those questions mean, because in some sense, we still care about counterfactual questions. I actually care about whether, taking the prescription drug caused my headache to subside or not. I actually want to be able to ask and potentially answer that question. So what the field of causal inference has done is not magically make those directly empirically tractable, but instead shed light on a possibility space for sets of assumptions that might be assumptions that a domain expert might be willing to admit, such that then those causal queries, like counterfactual queries, are actually ascertainable. You can actually estimate them by, for example, experimentation. Now, you can't get it for free. You need assumptions, but you can basically apply the magic of logic and mathematics to transform assumptions that look nothing like your conclusion, together with the appropriate kind of data, to answers to your questions that we all have about, fundamentally causal questions and counterfactual explanatory questions. So that has been possible. It's maybe debatable to the extent to which it's been possible, but there's a kind of possibility proof there that something that seems empirically intractable at first glance is not. So I wish I could tell you what exactly that's going to look like for neuroscience, and I don't know. I'm not a neuroscientist or a philosopher of neuroscience, so I'm probably not a good person to ask about that. Maybe some people have better ideas. But the hope is that by making clear what the problem is, we can start to at least, sort of scratch the surface on what possible assumptions might be, such that with available data gathering regimes that we do have available to us might shed light on causal questions. And actually, I should just say, the stuff that I mentioned, I should have said this at the get-go, but the same researcher, so Frederick Eberhardt, who was involved in this research, has actually been involved in causal discovery stuff in brain networks, and actually discovering new causal connections between brain areas that were either consistent with or even possibly novel to stuff that sort of body of literature in neuroscience. So it's certainly not that this is all off the table. Causal conclusions drawn from limited access to the thing. What we want to do, and this is where me as a logician comes to the problem, is I just want to understand what it would be and what it would take to be able to answer that question. And then it's domain experts to really say, are we anywhere near that? And I don't know.
Thank you so much. It's really interesting talk. I want to ask a bit about the relationship between exact causal abstraction versus approximate causal abstraction.
Yeah.
The definition you gave is very exact now, right? What does it mean for the diagram to approximately compute, or for the algebraic relationship to approximately?
Great, yeah, good question. This, I kind of very quickly glossed over this, partly because it itself is, there's a number of puzzles here. So here's the simplest thing you can do that I had in mind when I wrote this, that has been done in the literature. That is to put a distance metric on your high-level space. So your space of variables, you put a distance metric on that space, and then you basically say that, and there's different things you could do. You could take the average, so some distribution over interventions, or you could take the max distance over all interventions. There's a number of different things that you can do. And I think, well, I'll tell you, like, what we did was basically take, in this literature on the neural network analysis, it's rarely perfect. It was actually sometimes perfect, but it's rarely perfect. So we're actually often in this situation. And what we do basically is the kind of count and divide version. It's an average with essentially a uniform distribution. And if that's really high, I actually think there are reasons for worrying that number by itself is not inherently meaningful. Maybe say more about that, but comparative numbers seem to be meaningful, at least. So what we do is basically take a proportion of cases in which it succeeds. And then it succeeds perfectly. So this is not this squiggle thing. This is the thing about which intervention. So there's two dimensions already here. One is the distance metric. The other one is how does it work for all the interventions, most of them, whatever. So those are two different dimensions. There's actually a third dimension that interacts with these two in really complex ways. And that's when we bring in probability back into the picture. So nothing I talked about today really depended on that. But if you have causal system at low and high levels, and they both come with probability distributions, then there's also, what you get when you consider the bottom corner of the diagram is a probability. And now we can look at, for example, distance measures in probability space, right? So things like Shannon or KL or something, or symmetric KL, like different kinds of distance measures for probability. So all three of those are actually playing into what might be called approximate abstraction. And to my knowledge and understanding, this is not really as settled. I don't think we really understand this that well. Yeah.
So I have a quick related question, which was inspired by that slide and by the fact you mentioned Smolensky. As you know, one of the debates between Smolensky and Fodor was a contrast between implementing and approximating.
Yeah.
Particularly, the late Smolensky in the 1993 paper says, well, it's not quite right to think about the relation between a neural network and a classical models in terms of implementation. It's more like the letter is an approximation of the form of vice versa, depending what form a letter means in English. But anyway, it's a relation of approximation. I don't quite think that the kind of tools that you have here are going to be fine-grained enough to answer that question. Or do you think, or am I mistaken?
To determine whether it's perfect
implementation or an approximation.
Yeah, I mean, actually, I think in some ways it's kind of coming down inside of Smolensky.
That's right, because because what you said about the data, right? That looks much more like an approximation, right?
Except it's not. I mean, it's okay. In some cases, we get perfect abstraction.
Interesting.
Perfect abstraction. And interestingly, that was the very kinds of models that they were.
As the first of the BERT.
Yeah. Oh no, that's not.
No. Okay.
Well, actually, also with BERT. Yeah, I didn't mention that, but oh yeah, I should have mentioned that when we did this setting again, and then we went back with this new rotation idea to consider that. Then we basically get perfect abstraction. It had been imperfect before that, but then that rendered it perfect. But also in the very kinds of little models that were understudy in those debates, this is where you definitely get perfect abstraction.
So okay, good. That's cool. Is that in part because, as you mentioned, not for this one, but I think for the previous one, says there's one good answer to solve the problem. So there's one way to get it right. So the network conversion, that solution to somehow.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, I'm just speaking about why you might have this kind.
I mean, I do believe something like that, but about many problems, I do believe that that is true. I've never, I mean, this is maybe throw this out as just an open question. I've never seen a really good, maybe someone can point to one. I'd love to know what it is if you can. A really good example of a hard problem such that with sufficient, basically computational constraints, there exists only essentially one solution to the problem. But I believe it happens a lot. And I think these cases are some of them. But yeah.
So this one would be implementation. And so for the third example,
It's approximation. Exactly. Yeah.
Right.
You mentioned the slide that had the hypothesis about like approximating a computational model, things like that right there.
Here.
Yeah. So this is with respect to neural networks, correct?
Yeah, this was specifically respect to BERT, but also any model that solves this task.
Right. So like towards the end of the lecture, you're talking about like ideally if you perform experiments on human beings. So it's like the hypothesis perhaps that this also extends to the human brain, or
so I mean this was an artificial task. It's similar to ones that I think people perform well, but it's definitely not the same task. But yes, if we go basically yes, if we go back to and this is just putting my cards on the table, I suppose I don't have any more reasons to think this other than the ones we've already talked about. But if you go back to those kind of natural language inference examples that are extremely easy for people, I think we have pretty good hypotheses about how we do that. And there's been, you know, behavioral testing of them. There's been no, obviously, interventional testing of those hypotheses. But so they're hypotheses that are compatible with all the behavioral data. And I guess I do think that for some of those tasks, when suitably complex, that there are very few ways, if not essentially a single way to solve them. Yeah.
Yeah, so I wanted to ask about how fine-grained the lower level interventions have to be so as to still be informative about the higher level causal structure. And the reason I'm asking that is precisely because of these questions about potentially using this to discover the algorithmic structure implemented by a brain, say, and presumably we can't intervene on neurons, or it's very difficult to do it in an ethical way, neuron by neuron. But presumably it's at least possible that we can intervene in a slightly coarse-grained way. That is, you know, maybe you stimulate some cluster of neurons here using magnetic stimulation or something like that. And is that, so in these kinds of studies, can you still discover higher level causal structure by just sort of having slightly finer grained, but still relatively coarse-grained interventions?
Yeah, that's a fair question. It's basically, for the neuroscience case, it's basically a question about what is the right low level to start with. And I will just not go there.
Yeah, but in the algorithmic, in your sort of example.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, in the artificial.
Yeah.
Oh, good. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, yeah, I should also emphasize, and I said this, but they emphasized it, that the kinds of interventions that we have to do, especially in this latter work where we're rotating, is not just fix the activation values to be something. We also have to change the functions, right? So, I mean, I don't even know exactly what that means in the biological case. But here, we, like, you know, the thing is constructed as, you know, multiplication by a bunch of weight matrices and stuff. So we know exactly what that means. And so the interventions are fairly substantial. But yeah, you're right. I mean, it is, I don't know if it's more abstract or high level. It actually feels like, if anything, lower level. But to do this kind of thing, when we pull it back, we actually have to change the weights. We're not changing the activation levels, activation values. We're changing the weights. So that's already an example of what you're referring to here. And if we, what we saw over and over again was that for many of these tasks, even the hierarchical equality simple task with the feed-forward neural network, the small one, if you just restrict attention to changing the activation values, you won't find it. Right? So it's necessary to do that other type of low-level intervention.
So weights between the nodes.
Yeah, it has to be that. Yeah.
Any other question?
No? All right, so let's thank our speaker. So I think we have a reception in the lounge, so you're all welcome to attend. There should be some drinks and some food. All right, a small gift from the center as well, which is very